Hello and welcome everybody to the 53rd episode of Comic DNA, on which we will be reading The Eltingville Club by Evan Dorkin. With me today to discuss this graphic novel collection of short stories, comic book, I think comics is... Gabriel Dunston is the guest, and Gabe, you and I have discussed... Sorry. I'm really hamming up this intro, and it's not because of the...
To discuss this big-ass book of fucking comics. There you go, just say that.
There you go.
Wait, hold on, I can't remember. Are we allowed to cuss on this show?
Yeah, you can cuss. I mean, we're talking about an Evan Dorkin comic. You pretty much got to have a little flexibility with your cursing, right?
I had a comedian friend tell me that I cuss more than any others. Like, he's a professional comedian. He told me that I cuss more than any of the comedians that he's ever toured with. So, yeah.
Well, it doesn't bother me. So, Gabe, you've been on this show before. We've talked about lots of different books. I can't remember any of them off the top of my head.
Too Cool to Be Forgotten.
Oh, yeah. That was like an epic 3-hour long...
Or Creature Tech.
Creature Tech,
rather.
Mm-hmm. Blankets.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not ramble off topic too long. Let's talk a little bit about
you
Evan
called
Dorkin.
the wrong person.
I know.
You don't want to
I remember that Too Cool to Be Forgotten podcast. You know, that was the biggest pain in the butt to edit.
If memory serves, I kept you. There was 3 hours of audio in that episode.
That was after the edit. I edited it down to 3 hours. Oh, it was a mess.
I told my wife I was going to be recording another podcast tonight. She says, "How long are his episodes usually?" And I said, "They're usually at about an hour." She's like, "I'm not going to see you for the rest of the night. You're going to be doing this until the sun rises."
That's right. I fully expect to. Yes.
Yes, but, like the tattoo says, I'm wrong and I know, and I'm sorry.
So, I'm pretty excited to talk about this book, The Eltingville Club by Evan Dorkin. I'm just jumping right into it. I'm going to try to steer the ship back on track.
Yes, we waste too much time,
yes.
And there's so much to talk about in this thing.
There is a lot to talk about. First of all, this is a book that you recommended to me.
Yes, sir.
I have... This is going to sound very similar to the last episode I did with my friend Alex on building stories, where I say, you know, of course, I'm a comic book guy, and I know comics. Like, I know who Chris Ware is, but I've never read Chris Ware. And it's the same exact thing. I know who Evan Dorkin is. I've read a little bit of Milk and Cheese. I've seen his comics around. And I know him from one of my absolute favorite cartoons of all time, Space Ghost Coast to Coast.
Space Ghost Coast to Coast.
That's right, where he was a writer. Yeah. So I'm very familiar, quote unquote, with Evan Dorkin, except I don't own any Evan Dorkin comics. So this was the first, my first like real sit down and just immerse myself into an Evan Dorkin comic. And I was short initial response. I was very, very pleased that you recommended this to me.
I figured you would like it.
Yeah. You definitely had me pegged on that one. So I know you are a pretty big fan of Evan Dorkin. Is that correct?
100%, yes. And my question is, do we begin by talking about the man himself, because he's a character that needs to be unpacked?
Yeah, I think.
And there is a lot of him.
Yeah, before we really get into like what this book is, like I want you to lay out some of this Evan Dorkin knowledge.
Okay, I'm going to throw down. Evan Dorkin is a professional comics writer and artist. He works in black and white. He's been like, one of the reasons I like him so much is he was a professional guy that I looked up to, because he's what you would call a working cartoonist. Like he would get a gig every now and then, do a 5-page filler here, do a 2-page story there, write this thing. So dude would hustle. And I liked his style. He got his start in comics in the early 90s during the boom and just after the bust. He did a lot of black and white indie stuff. And he did a lot of short comics that were written and drawn by himself, and they would show up in different titles, mostly in Dark Horse titles. Mm-hmm. And he would do, back when Marvel was doing anthologies, he'd write for this one, he'd draw for that one, he'd write and draw for this one. Like, it'd be 5 5 pages at a time, 2 backup pages, sometimes 7, sometimes 10 pages. So but this was in the 90s when it was possible to be a working cartoonist, and the situation has changed pretty dramatically. So what happens is he'd have a pile of mishmashed black and white, mostly satirical humor comics, and he would collect them in his own anthologies. And his last name is Dorkin, so he had this own self-made anthology that he'd put out through Slave Labor Graphics called Dork, that would collect a lot of random comics that couldn't go anywhere, and it would also it was where he would collect the short stories for Milk and Cheese, which he's most famous for personally. It's also where he would collect what we're reading today, Eltingville Club, and a bunch of other little recurring characters that he'd have. He also did this indie comic called Hectic Planet, which when it first came out, it was called Pirate Corps, and it was this schizophrenic, crazy 90s, science fiction adventure in this, and like think of just the aesthetic of everything in the 90s. If you remember, everything is extremely densely packed. Like every convenience store is very densely packed. Every record store is just as much shelf space as possible, so you kind of have to dig and search for the thing you want, but the thing you want is in the store. Well, that sensibility is reflected in his art, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So Hectic, like, it started the Pirate Corps because it was about this ship of, not necessarily pirates, but like think the Millennium Falcon if it was fully manned. And then it turned more and more into like just some slice of life stories from a far-flung future that's similar to Transmetropolitan, only a lot less gravitas, a lot more, teenage and college-aged angst and relationship stuff. And that's kind of where he cut his teeth in terms of writing long-term stories. And I've got the first two trades of what, it started as Pirate Corps, and then he changed the name to Hectic Planet. Got the first 2 trades. It's lovely. Read it, and then saw Firefly, the TV series, and said, this is kind of nice, but this reminds me of something. Oh, it's an indie comic that I've got on my shelf. Wow, Joss Whedon doesn't really come up with his own stuff, does he? And I just as a brief aside, I'm not accusing the venerable Wheaton of plagiarism. I am instead accusing him of just kind of subconsciously sucking up all the zeitgeist around him and spitting it out in a way, and for some reason what he spits out is more successful and popular than the originals that he first consumed. So anyway, that's where Eltingville Club came from. In the introduction at the beginning of the book, he had 10 pages to fill in this humor comic he was putting out, and so he made this satire of him and his nerd friends from high school and how over-the-top nerdy fanboys they were, and it's very, very 90s. And just the names that they drop and the things that they would do, it's very, very clear. Like each chapter of Eltingville dates when it came out. Like they're talking about seeing The Crow when it's in theaters. Now there's something very important to add about Evan Dorkin. He's from New York. He's just outside of the city. I want to say Long Island. Maybe New Jersey, I can't quite remember, but he's from that area. He was, by his own account, a shitty kid, who, was kind of the product of his environment. He grew up in a shitty environment. I don't know specifics because I haven't read that autobio chapter in a while. But he grew up in a shitty environment and was a shitty guy. And he worked in a comic shop, and he was the shitty comic shop guy who, while you're checking out, just looks at what you're checking out, gives you that stupid little gaze and sighs at you and tells you why the things you're buying suck. And he talks about every movie, every comic book adaptation movie, and why it sucks so bad and how it sucks so bad in how many different ways. But the thought, the very concept of not going to see it just never entered his mind. So he was that guy. And I just cannot express enough what a shitty person he was, and how much he grew, because this is one of my favorite parts about Evan Dorkin is Evan Dorkin doesn't work alone. Evan Dorkin is one name of a team. He's actually a husband and wife team. His wife is Sarah Dyer. She would do the colors for his covers whenever he put out an issue of Dork or an issue of Hectic Planet or Pirate Corps. And what's really interesting is Sarah is a comic creator in her own right. She's one of my favorite female creators of all time. She ran her own black and white indie anthology series called Action Girl Comics, which I highly, highly recommend. If you can find the back issues, get them and read, because it's a beautiful time capsule of where indie comics were at the time. And there were so many fewer female creators at the time, and so she would take the time to be like, here's the female creators that they are, and here's the good ones, and she put them all under one roof and made it easier to find them and read their stuff, and it was great. It was that way that I discovered Jessica Abel. So Evan Dorkin is writing these big long diatribes and the introductions to each issue of Dork, and what's amazing is I bought a stack of these all at once, and like in one of them he says, I'd like to share a special thanks to Sarah Dyer for doing my colors. She does such a good job of my colors, and she's such a cool person, and I learned a lot from her. Like, just something like that. Mm-hmm. And each time each issue of Dork would come out, he would mention Sarah a little bit more, and it's clear it's clear that like Dork 1 came out and they weren't dating yet, and then like Dork 2 and 3 they were dating. Dork 4, 5, and 6 they were married. Mm. But anyway, they've been married for ages. They've got a daughter who I want to say is 12, somewhere in there. And so Evan Dorkin did not write for Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Evan and Sarah write for Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Mm-hmm. And if it were not for Sarah Dyer, I guarantee. No, I'm allowed to cuss here. I guarantee. My bad. I guarantee Eltingville Club, this book here, would not come out, because what constitute the last 2 chapters of this book nearly killed him. Mm-hmm. He like, for one, as we're gonna unpack it, he's perhaps the absolute most dense comic creator I've ever seen in terms of like his panel count. He's hitting 12 panels on a page, which is kind of insane. Even for gold, silver, and bronze age comic creators, 12 panels on a page is ridiculous. 9 is a lot. It's dense, and then you look at it and it's just so much text, and then below that text are all of his drawings. They're black and white, but there's so many lines and there's so much texture. It's strange. Like, he's got this way about his artwork, the way that Drew Wang used to have, Drew Wang and a couple of other people, where it stopped being art and just started being mark making. It's as though looking at somebody's artwork, you're watching somebody deal with their anxieties on a page with all the mark making that happens. Mm-hmm. And for most artists, when they do that, it ruins the artwork on the page, makes it look cluttered and awful. And kind of what I think makes Dorkin certainly an underrated artist is the fact that he can do that and make things so busy and make things so dense. And it's still not only legible, but legible and high quality and readable, and still lots of fun to read. But his artwork is so dense that the last 2 chapters are 22 pages each, and one of them took him like a couple months to do, and the other one took him a solid year. Like, he had health problems, he had business problems, he had problems for a good 2 years. And if it was not for his wife, whom as far as I could tell, seeing them from the outside, without her being the rock of their relationship, the rock of their family, with the gentle hand and the understanding and love of somebody who wants to see him and the family succeed, to just kind of gently push him along. Without her, this wouldn't have gotten made. Like Evan Dorkin is on the byline, but from where I sit, Sarah Dyer's got every bit as much to do with this book as he did. And I quickly add,
she's credited in the hardcover. She's credited with colors, computer chops, and patience. I think that's spelled it out there.
I've been very lucky to meet these people in person.
Right.
Evan Dorkin is one of my very first indie comic idols, indie comic icons, one of the guys that I looked up to. Everybody pointed to people like the Hernandez brothers, and I just couldn't get into it. But I pick up an issue of Dork, and I'm like, this is what I like. This is it. Black and white indie humor books. This is great. And so he was my first starstruck celebrity sighting when I went to Heroes Con for the first time. Because I recognized him because he looks like one of the characters from Eltingville Club.
Right.
And he's a regular at Heroes Con, so over my years of tabling there, I've gotten more acquainted with he and with the good lady Dyer, to the point where they recognize me and they'll chat with me and they'll tolerate me just fine, which is very lovely, and it's a nice place to be.
It's very kind of them, because I've been around you, and it's a challenge.
Yeah, it's difficult, and if they're at the hotel bar and a little bit liquored up, then they're even friendly with me.
I remember when I did Heroes Con a few years ago, and you and I shared a table. Evan Dorkin came over and was talking to you, and I wanted to go to his table and see him, but I hate approaching comic book professionals, especially if I have nothing to say to them, because I didn't own any of his books, and I could have bought something from him and told him I like him, I want to check it out, but I got this thing where I can't do that. That's
you have this thing where you get nervous around people you respect.
I'm just crazy, is what it is. I don't like talking to people in general, and especially people that are successful. But
man, what's great about him as a character is the success of Evan and Sarah is a highly variable thing. It was one of the biggest wake-up calls, because this is one of the first guys I knew of who was a working cartoonist, and I had the idea, I can do this for a living, it's a job. And one year he was having a really bad year, and he was telling me about it, and it was just disheartening, because I was in the middle of, geez, I wonder if I'll ever be able to make it, and here comes from where I stand, the Grand Master Dorkin telling me about his bad year, and I'm like, oh crap, I have no chance.
Right. Yeah, that's frustrating, huh?
Yeah. Almost as frustrating as how tangential and long-winded I get.
Well, I've come to terms with that a long time ago. But
you too shall be cited in a book for your patience.
Someday.
Yeah.
But
all right, so
let's talk.
That's our crash course on the man Dorkin. Oh, yeah. Also, Eltingville. He does work for Adult Swim on an occasional basis. He and Sarah wrote for Space Ghosts, and I can't remember what shows specifically, but they were at least invited to write for a couple of episodes of a couple of early Adult Swim shows. I don't know. I don't remember specifics, but they were also given a pilot to make Eltingville Club, the series.
Right. I wanted to bring that up, actually.
If you want to check it out, it's on YouTube. You can watch the pilot.
Weird thing about the Welcome to Eltingville pilot. Somehow, I really can't explain how, it completely went under my radar. And this would have been at a time when I was incredibly invested in Adult Swim. When Adult Swim first came out, that was my thing, because I really loved Space Ghost, and they were selling it as if you like Space Ghost, then check out all these other cartoons that we're going to do. It's all in the spirit of Space Ghost. Cartoons for adults, adults, even though, teenagers.
Well, the weird thing about Adult Swim was how gradually they made it, because they did Space Ghost halfway on a lark and halfway just to see if that sort of thing would fly, because if it does fly, then they've got some creatives who are already on salary at the Cartoon Network building, people like Dave Willis. So if Space Ghost works, then they can hire Dave Willis, Matt Malero, and a handful of extremely cheap animators to make a similar show. Which was now Aqua Teens. But when they premiered Aqua Teens, they premiered it at 4 a.m. on Christmas Eve. Something.
Oh yeah.
So they do this thing where they barely give their new idea a chance.
Right.
And then after that, they got licensing for other shows. And then after that, whenever they would put out a pilot of a new show that they wanted to test out, they would do what they did with Aqua Teens. They would put it as far under the radar as possible. Wait until 3, 4 in the morning. Wait until a night where nobody's watching. Like, wait until like a Tuesday night.
Right, right. But like what I'm saying is I don't know how I missed this because I was the person that was staying up and watching like every Sunday night all of the Adult Swim stuff. And
as a brief aside, did you see the Korgoth pilot?
I don't know if I remember that one.
It's basically Conan the Barbarian.
I do remember a Conan parody. I don't remember much about it though.
Okay. Because, like, just, you know, the reason it was under your radar is because they try to put those things under the radar.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was just, I like when I eventually was reading about them doing the cartoon and I saw it and I was just like, I have no memory of this whatsoever. And it's just so weird because it's the kind of thing that I would have been 100% invested in.
Yeah, yeah. I have this weird thing. Sorry, I kicked my microphone. I saw the pilot when it aired, and the pilot is based on a chapter of this book. It was a short that appeared in a Dork issue that I had. So I read the Dork issue, and months later I see this pilot, and it's so long that I forgot the Dork issue. So I watched this pilot, and I'm like, man, this is really familiar. I wonder what this is about. And then years later, like, I forget about the pilot. And I read this Eltingville Club collected book, or I reread some of my old Dork issues, and I read that chapter again and says, oh man, I feel like I have this, did I dream that this was animated? That was a dream, right? And so when I looked up on YouTube and saw, like, there's the pilot for everybody to see, or when I flipped to the back of this book, it's as though, oh, holy shit, I didn't dream that. That was real.
Right. Yeah, that was a weird discovery for me to learn that existed. And
did you look up the pilot? Did you watch?
I did. I didn't watch the whole thing, but I watched like the first third of it.
You didn't. It's.
I
22 minutes of your life is too much.
So if you want to get into actual specifics, I literally finished reading.
Actually, I'm gonna cut you off.
Yeah.
No, I don't want to get into specifics because I want to talk about the pilot at the end.
All right, that's fine. But
aren't I a gracious guest? I cut you right the hell off on your own show. Why? A, why do you put up with me at all? B, why do you even have me on this thing? I'm a horrible person.
All 10 of my listeners are gonna be upset with you, and since you're one of them, you make up like 10% of the audience. So that's
When I listen to myself, I'm like, dude, shut up. Aaron is way more interesting than you. Shut your mouth.
We're not going to go through this back and forth again. But
is this a conversation we've had?
I can't remember. I've got them all like recorded. Let's talk a little bit about the book.
All right.
Let's get into the actual book itself.
I'm into it.
So, one of the things, I guess we haven't like outright stated what this is. I think you may have mentioned it, kind of glossed over it. But what the Eltingville Club is it's about a group of 4 nerds, essentially teenagers, that form their comic book, science fiction, fantasy, horror, role-playing club. Where basically they just hang out and talk about all their nerdy shit. And
yeah, these are like they're. I've grown up in the South my whole life, and these guys clearly live in like a Staten Island or a Long Island or somewhere in New Jersey, and it weirds me out that they would be in, you know, they're up in the north, so close to all the big cities, but they're essentially in a small town where these are the only 4 nerds at their high school.
Right.
And so they gravitate towards each other and formalize the relationship because that is what sour, awkward nerds do.
Right. Well, that was essentially how I was able to easily kind of identify with the characters right away, because that was basically my high school life. Like, my friends were like the 6 other kids that I went to school with that were all sort of interested in comic books or video games or role playing in some fashion, you know.
Yeah.
So
and
most
telling of all, it's comic book, science fiction, fantasy,
exactly.
So like each person, there's a 4-way Venn diagram where there's a little overlap between each people.
Oh yeah.
But each one of these 4 guys is so hard up for friends that that overlap is enough.
That's exactly how it was with me and my friends. I was the comic book guy. Another friend was the video game guy. Another guy was the card game guy. Another guy was the anime guy. Like that really encapsulated like the hard truth when like so and so is the secretary of comic books, and they all kind of have their own identities that are all sort of under this umbrella of like geek dork fandom.
Yeah. So let's introduce our players, shall we?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, we've got William Dickey, Secretary of Comic Books. William Dickey wears a plaid coat with a collar and a lapel and usually black t-shirt, and he has glasses. It should be noted William Dickey looks basically like Evan Dorkin with slightly longer hair.
Right.
I recognized Evan Dorkin in person because I thought he looked exactly like William Dickey. Peter D'Annunzio, Secretary of Horror. Peter is deep into horror movies and all of that shtick. He loves the classics. Like, he thinks that Peter Cushing is one of the great horror masters. He adores Christopher Lee. All that jazz. So if it's horror and low budget screamer movies, he's into it. And that's basically as far as he goes. Everything else in this nerd group is just a passing fancy that he likes enough, but he's not that big of a fan.
Right.
He is the stereotype of obnoxious, slightly unhinged New Jersey. Like he's got the, and he's very, very quick with his temper. All right. So Jerome T. Stokes, otherwise known as Jerry, Junior Secretary of Fantasy Gaming. He's the only member of the group that plays Magic the Gathering, and he's essentially the impetus behind every time they play Dungeons and Dragons. He's emotionally the most level-headed of all the guys there. He's honestly the only person who remembers that they're there to have fun. You could sum him up with the phrase, "Come on, guys."
Right.
Last but not least, Josh Levy, the token fat guy with a ponytail, thick-rimmed glasses. Josh for short, Secretary of Science Fiction. He's the one who has VHS tapes flying all over creation. And character-wise, he's here's the weird dynamic. Like, Peter has the thing that he's into, and he's willing to listen to everybody else's thing and have a good time. Pete, Jerry wants friends, and these other 3 guys is pretty much the only friends he has access to at their age group.
Mm-hmm.
Josh is the world's saddest fanboy because at the heart of fandom is this parasitic consumer culture, and it's just ripping him by the heartstrings and using him like a marionette. And so emotionally he's all over the place, and he is essentially a sad chump. Now William Dickey, Bill, is his foil. He's also kind of pulled all over the place, but he's the twist of the group. He's the jerk bag who doesn't mind that he's a jerk bag and kind of blames it on everybody else. And because Josh is so easily thrown around, Bill throws Josh around all the time, and the other 2 either participate or sit back and watch. And that's essentially their dynamic.
And Bill is also sort of like the self-proclaimed leader of the group. To a degree.
Yes, he is the club president.
Yes.
He's the one that decided, hey, we should all get together regularly and codify our friendship into a club. Because then that's like, looking at it cynically, that's control tactic.
Right.
Now he has solidified this is the group because he looks at it like this is a group that I can manipulate. This is our group. Nobody else in, nobody goes out, and I'm head of this group. And that's just who he is and where he lives.
And he's also like clearly the most assertive out of everyone in the group. Which is why he and Josh are always at heads, because Josh is fairly assertive, but he's not as good at it as Bill is.
Yeah, and for Bill, the group exists for him to exert his weight upon it.
Right.
And exert his weight upon it in the shittiest way possible. They have this great idea for how to settle disputes, and it's percentile dice. They all carry around 2d10.
Right.
And roll, and whoever's got the highest percentile, they do their thing. Bill has loaded dice.
Right.
Bill has loaded dice, and screw you guys.
Right.
And, all 3 out of the 4 of them engage in petty theft on occasion. Bill, Pete, and Josh will steal things on occasion. Josh, most occasionally of all. Pete will take little things. Bill will just steal. Bill will just throw anything down his pants if he can get away with it. Like, all of life to Bill is just, can I get away with this?
Right.
And the answer is almost always no, but he'll do it anyway, and then blame you for catching him.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He definitely has, often exhibits that sort of, what is that? That, resentful, like he's aware of his actions, but, he will push his guilt onto you, and
Yeah. He's the twist.
Right.
He is there to destroy whatever group he's in. He's codependent as hell, and despite being the most assertive person there, he is also the biggest loser there, which you discover more at the end.
Yeah. So that was like talking about kind of going from the beginning to the end. That was one thing that really struck me about this book. Like, well, first of all, it was like this hardcover book that I think you read the hardcover too, right? I know you said you have all these old issues, but
my local comic shop is a husband. It's wonderful because he looks like every comic shop guy you've ever known from the 80s. But and he'll talk like one too. He's a talkative guy who has knowledge that is as esoteric as it gets. And he's got as many VHS tapes of obscure, weird nonsense in his shop as he does back issues. But my local comic shop is actually a husband and wife team. And she works the register on Sundays so that they can spend their Sundays together. And that's when me and my daughter go. And they're very warm people. But what I was getting at was both of them are Evan Dorkin fans. Both of them will push him as hard as they can. So, and like I went through all of the back issues, getting as much Action Girl as I can, getting all the dorks that I can. And so he let me know that this was coming out in hardcover. Like the last 2 chapters were individual issues put out by Dark Horse, which was brand new because Eltingville were always parts of anthologies. And so he put those issues out so that he could finish the story, put the characters to bed, and make this hardcover. So it's one of those. It's the thing that me and my local store owners had in common. We loved Evan Dorkin and we loved Sarah Dyer. And so when they announced that the hardcover was coming, like my comic shop owner and I kind of bonded over that and high-fived. Hell yes, I want the hardcover.
Yeah. Well, the only reason I bring that up is because this book compiles all of the Eltingville comics that he's done, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
All the Eltingville is in here. And the last 2 single issues of Eltingville finish it off. And it's like I said, each of these is just a backup story. These are just stories,
right?
But the last 2 issues make it into the not a collection of stories, but one whole. It's like a TV show that was made to be just one season.
Yeah. Well, because the only reason I'm bringing it up, as I said, was because this is a collection of comics that he's done over the course of like 20 years.
Yeah. So, like in the very first story, they talk about rewatching The Crow in theaters.
Right.
And
Exactly.
in the second to last story, when they're still in high school,
Yeah.
everybody's got smartphones, and somebody talks about reading the Saga comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I
So
noticed
essentially,
that. Yeah.
These guys stay in high school for like 10 or 20 years. And just don't age.
But one of the things that struck me while reading this book was that similar to, I'm just going to keep referencing this last episode that I recorded about Chris Ware's Building Stories, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
When I read Building Stories, I was discussing with my friend Alex, and I said Building Stories just struck something deep inside me, and I had just like this uncomfortable connection with the story. Like I was just like, I felt like I was reliving parts of my life, reading through that comic. And in the first chapter, the one from like 1994, which is also like probably the shortest chapter, like as you were saying, it was like a backup strip essentially.
Yeah, I think 10 pages.
Yeah, I had that same feeling. I was rereading this, and I was just like, oh my god.
Yeah.
This is like exactly like what me and my friends were like in high school. Just like sitting around a table, role playing, just eating snacks and arguing with each other and getting overly emotional and animated about just like the dumbest, pointless shit,
Yeah.
And I had that same feeling.
And then somebody like while you're playing D&D, somebody interjects, "Oh, holy shit, guys, it's our prom.
It's our prom tonight." Yeah, exactly.
And then there's just a silence, and
and then they just move
back
on.
to this.
Yeah. That doesn't, whatever.
And that one silent panel, like speaking as both somebody who was in high school and then turned around and taught some high school kids, just that panel is the saddest panel in the world because every single one of them just silently mourned the fact that is a big part of this stage of life that they just cannot or will not participate in.
Right. They're all just silently, uncomfortably glowering, kind of at nobody in particular.
Yeah, and it's not the, oh, well, I don't care, which is, of course, what they'll say, but it's they mourn that fact. They take a second to mourn it.
Yeah, so, like, I liked this first story, and, I was struck with that, like, it really resonated with me, because it's just like, wow, Evan Dorkin, he just captured that. Like, he really was that guy, And as the book progresses through the years,
it got darker.
It got way darker. And
see, like when in the beginning, like I didn't identify. I was just like, oh, that's kind of funny. But when it got dark is when I started to get chills. Because when it got dark is when I said, oh shit, I recognize myself.
Well, that might be something you want to talk to a psychologist about.
No, I'm not gonna. Why would I talk to a psychologist? I've got a podcast full of literally tens of people.
Tens of people. We're approaching a baker's dozen.
Oh shit! Well, if I can get my wife to sit through one of these,
yeah. But yeah,
she'll get through the first half hour and be like, "Damn, Gabe,
yeah, they haven't even started talking about the
3
book
hours."
So as the book progresses, and as you said, it gets darker. I did start to lose that "this is me" feeling because I resonated with the first chapter so much, and then as it gets darker and darker, and I was just like, oh man, like me and my friends were never like this. Like we didn't like commit arson and like get really violent.
It got more and more over the top.
Yeah, but I have to say, although I did start like losing that like intimate connection. It did start to get more entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely think that I still was drawn into the book because it was getting more entertaining to me. So there was like reading this was kind of a weird experience because it started off like as like like I felt like this profound connection where I was like, oh man, this is going to be like me totally connecting with all these characters. And then I just like gradually, not too gradually, it really wasn't that long, I lost that connection, and then it started to become this really funny parody of like me and my friends, and like to extreme degrees, where, like I said, the connection is gone, but it started to get really funny, which is not to say that it wasn't funny in the beginning, but it was funny like in an endearing, identifiable way, and then it became really funny of like, man, yeah, fuck these guys,
like it's that weird paradoxical feeling. It's like, oh, I was never one of these guys. Oh right. Shit, I was totally one of these guys. Whereas you have the opposite paradox. It's like, oh shit, I was totally these guys. Wait, no, I was never these guys.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's what happened for me. So maybe
it's kind of like a satire along the lines of a Spinal Tap or a Mighty Wind.
Yes,
and that
yes.
The people who made Spinal Tap and Mighty Wind, A, loved the 80s metal, and B, loved bluegrass music. It is, which is why the lampooning was so effective, because they're so deep in it, and it comes from a place of knowledge and love and affection.
Yeah, absolutely. And
like nobody can pick on your brother-in-law the way that you can, because you know that guy.
Right. And too many people like that they were lampooning were like too connected with it. Like when Spinal Tap came out and Ozzy Osbourne, it's like, that's not funny. That stuff actually happened to me.
Twisted Sister spent the entire movie like they just made a documentary about our lives. Like Dee Snider had this perfect Hello Cleveland story.
Yeah.
Where they just get lost underneath a stage, whereas Dee Snider and the band finally find the way out, come out on stage, but they're on the wrong stage. They hear the crowd screaming for Twisted Sister. They're late, and they finally find the way out, and they're in the wrong stage. So they hear the crowd, but see an empty auditorium.
That's funny. That is funny. But to go back to the book, try to cut down on the non sequiturs, as it were. So you think you saw yourself more and more as the book progressed, as the characters got more unlikable, more hateful, more violent?
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit? Because I think, as I was saying, how I stopped seeing myself in the characters, but it started to seem like a really apt parody or satire. What I did see was like, I guess maybe I would describe it as like a sub-layer of myself, like fantasies that I would maybe indulge in, but never actually.
Like, this isn't me, but this guy is somewhere in me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's how I would describe it. But it also, like the situations start to get more. Like, it's not just the characters acting, sillier. Like, the situations start to feel a little more grandiose than the initial, the initial four nerds sitting around a table, D&D.
Yeah.
And then you get to...
I mean, it ends with, spoiler alert, it ends with them starting a riot at, I guess, San Diego.
It's supposed to be San Diego, I think, yeah. The big Comic-Con,
Right. So, it ends, like, the second to last chapter, one of them sets fire to the local comic shop and burns it to the ground.
Right.
And then the last chapter is 10 years later, and at the end of it, they start so, yeah, the whole book is just ramping up how ridiculous these guys get.
Mm-hmm. And kind of playing with... I thought one of the things that kept me kind of, like, on edge was the way Dorkin kept stringing along this idea of, like, why are these guys friends? Like, what's their connection other than just the club itself? Like, they're the only guys they know that are sort of into this, so that's why they're friends. And
it's like that kid in the neighborhood. There's one kid who's got the pool, and there's one kid who's got the trampoline, and you have to be just friendly enough so that you can use the pool or the trampoline.
Exactly.
I was the trampoline kid, by the way.
Well, lucky you. I was neither.
Like in the neighborhood where I grew up, like I'm the youngest of 5, so when my parents moved in, there was lots of kids for my siblings, and when it was my turn, there was like 3 kids, and my next door neighbor on one side was cool, she was great. Next door neighbor on the other side was hit and miss, and then there was like 2 other kids in the neighborhood, and they were shitty. But we were the only kids in the neighborhood. So we would play together every week, and every week we would swear never to play together again because fuck those kids.
Right. So, like, tonally, as the book progresses, I think Dorkin's pretty upfront about kind of how mean-spirited it is.
Yeah. And codependent. How codependent these, like, the reason that they stay together is because they created a codependency.
Right, but I mean, like, tonally, like, even, like, what he's, like kind of, like, what he's satirizing, like, it stops being, like, loving satire of comic book nerds, and at some point kind of becomes, like, mean satire of
Yes.
characters, which I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying, like, when the book starts off, you kind of expect in a more traditional narrative, these characters would get into arguments and they would have, like, a big falling out, and then they would kind of, like, eventually kind of come back together and remember, like, what brought them together in the first place is that their love of the medium, and they're able to overlook their differences, and
very American TV.
It's all like, comics are so great that they can bring people together. That is not how this comic ends. This comic ends with them all telling each other to go fuck themselves, basically, and it's just like their relationships just get worse and worse and worse.
And
which I enjoy.
Brings out the worst in each other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly how they encourage the worst aspects of each other, and I enjoyed that about this book because again, one of the things that I'm always whining about on this podcast is that I really love a book that has a personal voice, like something that you just know that that's from that author, and it just doesn't sound like something you can get from anybody else. And this was like beautifully unique. Like, I'm sure there are other, like, mean parodies. You don't have to look very far. I've read Dan Clow's comics. He does plenty of mean parodies of comic book nerds. But Peter Bagg. But there's something unique and special about Dorkin. The way it's almost heartfelt. It's almost like, I guess that's comes from it being so personal. Like, this is who he is, but it's also kind of who he's making fun of, and it's also kind of who he hates. I don't want to get too armchair psychological on here because I don't really know.
No. You're not even being armchair psychological. He's very upfront about it.
Yeah, that was my guess.
Like, there's no small amounts of self-loathing in this book because the worst human being in this book looks exactly like the author.
Yeah, and he kind of ends up being the villain of the story, really.
He is the biggest loser out of the four. We see them when they're grown up, and he is a loser with capital letters.
Mm-hmm. When they reunite 10 years later.
Yeah.
Like, he's the only one that really doesn't have anything going on.
So let's follow this thread before we give away too much of the ending.
Sure.
It starts out more lighthearted and then starts turning up and turning up. So let's talk about that. I want to pull on that thread and point to the parts where it starts getting darker.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I hate to be this guy. I hate to be armchair psychologist guy, but the psyche behind each of these characters is so dense and twisted. It's difficult to unpack. And what it is what they call fandom. The characters in the book, what these characters call fandom, and what people are calling fandom today. There's another word for it. It's called consumerism. It's consumer cult. You're buying a thing just to buy it. In the second short, it opens up with there's trading cards in the Wonder Bread.
Yeah.
And one of them got the trading card. So of course, Josh, who is easily the biggest victim of this mindset, he's seething, he has to get that card. And so it follows them as they go from like 4 or 5, let's see, they go to McDonald's, they go to Taco Bell, they go to Burger King, and they're going to get the stuff. Like, they used to have the movie tie-ins used to be much more prevalent in the 90s and early 2000s, where they would have like commemorative cups and stuff. So they're going to each one and collecting as much as they can just to collect it.
I tell you right now, I'm drinking a nice whiskey cherry Coke out of my collectible Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring Aragorn goblet. I think it came from Burger King.
Straight up, I wish I was having whiskey and cherry Coke right now. So, like, the most telling part, something that drives me, because, like, I was a little kid, and the way that the way that the stuff is advertised and marketed, even the movies that I didn't like, I felt this weird urge to buy the stuff. So, do you remember the movie Congo?
I remember it very clearly.
Okay, I don't at all because I didn't see it because
I remember when it came out.
All of the previews said to me, "Wow, piece of crap movie." So I didn't see it. But there's this panel where Taco Bell is selling commemorative watches. And they sold out, so Josh can't get a watch. The whole thing is just watching Josh get frustrated. He's going to each place trying to get a collectible thing. And he's literally losing his mind that he can't get collectible things. So how could you be out of the third... I was told the third Congo watch would be here this week. Well, sir, it was here this week, but we sold out yesterday. How could you be sold out? It's a shitty monkey movie.
Right.
Like, this movie is so shitty, nobody would buy these watches. If it was a shitty movie, A, why did you see it? And B, why do you now want the watches? So, like, did you see that South Park episode about how, like, free-to-play games aren't?
Oh, yeah.
And
that was one of the good episodes of that
It's
season.
a great episode. So to cut it short, Stan has a smartphone. Stan starts having this free-to-play game, and it times out and keeps sending him these notifications. Hey, the people in your social network are counting on you to play this game. If you spend like $1 or $2, the clock will start over. So Stan becomes addicted to the game and spends all of the money and all of the credit cards that were attached to his parents.
Yes.
And so, like, the devil himself sits down and explains, well, you've got this chemical in your brain called dopamine.
I love that joke.
Yeah.
Prepare to see the depths of the human soul.
And
so anyway, you got your dopamine.
So the devil explains, the people who made this game understand how to manipulate you on a deep level. Like, they're manipulating your amygdala, basically. They're manipulating your animal brain. And so you're watching Josh get ripped apart because the marketing pushes of his day worked on him so well. He has to consume. And that is how these guys, except for the Magic player, that is how these guys view being a fan or being a good fan, is how much do I consume?
I think that's an aspect of it.
Yeah. So, like, at the end of this short, what happens is Josh keeps getting frustrated. He's not picking up anything. He goes to Toys R Us and, oh, holy shit, a kid got a toy before he did. How dare that kid?
Right.
And, like, that struck a chord with me because I was a kid at Toys R Us getting all the Star Wars stuff. And I was the only kid in the aisle. There's a bunch of adults who are a bunch of fat comic nerds who look like Josh, buying up all of the Star Wars stuff that they can with their adult money. And meanwhile, it took me a month to scrape together the $5, and I'm trying to decide what I want, and too late, some asshole adult bought it so he could put it up on eBay.
So
Josh gets frustrated. Some kid gets a toy before he gets a chance. The King Alien, I might add, which is an action figure made from a comic book and not a movie. So Josh goes to the grocery store, goes to the Wonder Bread section, and opens every loaf of bread the way a compulsive gambler spends their life savings at the slot machine.
Right.
Looking for the one card. And then he gets caught. And then he's in just deep trouble. And he gets in trouble with his parents who have to pay for everything. And it ends with him sobbing. So, like, for me, that was the first moment of darkness, was just listening to the way that these guys talk to their parents, and their parents enable them by basically taking it. Like, they kind of yell back too, but they don't do anything about it. They don't step in and say, hey, you're not allowed to be this crazy about this much nothing. They're just like, don't you dare use that tone with me or I'll ground you. And just ignoring the fact that they're watching a mental illness just become invented and then become cultivated.
Well, I think, as I said, I think that's an aspect of it. I think the interaction with the parents is an important distinction to make. because the parents are not really seen all that often. If I'm not mistaken, they're only ever heard off panel. And
Yeah,
I think
you see the back of some parents once, but that's it.
Yeah, and I do think that's an important thing. Maybe it wasn't entirely intentional, but I do think that it successfully gets across the point that these kids, these four guys, don't necessarily have a strong relationship with their parents.
The most socially well-adjusted of these four, like when you hear his parents once or twice, and the once or twice that you hear them, they're being parents. They're like, we need to really talk about this because this is not healthy.
Well, that's what happens at the end, where you see when their friendship breaks up and all the parents are talking to him. And yeah, his mom is the one that says, when your dad gets back from his business trip, we'll talk about this more. And I think that pretty much says everything you need right there. He doesn't necessarily come from a broken home or an abusive home, but he is somebody whose father is absent.
Yeah, and it's equally telling because in that same, like, in that...
And the mom isn't even really yelling at him.
Yeah, and in the back, it's another thing with the worst guy, Bill. They mentioned in passing, maybe it was the divorce.
Divorce? Yeah.
Maybe it was
like that was my
divorce,
fault.
But like that was my fault. Jesus.
Right.
So,
and he's just, his thought bubble is, Christ, Mom, can't this wait? I'm trying to watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. here.
Yeah. So anyway, the first little touch of darkness is the interaction with their parents and Josh just watching his mind tear apart because consumerism masking as noble fandom worked on him so well, and he was just frustrated by it so much that it's not committed theft, but just destroyed a lot of property.
Well, I'm gonna take a slight counterpoint and say that while I don't disagree with your diatribe about consumerism there, the red-blooded American in me will not let that stand unchallenged. And I'm going to say, while again, I don't disagree, I do think that that's just an aspect of it. As we established, that they don't have strong relationships with their parents,
or with any other kids,
any other kids. Exactly, they're all outcasts. So their entire identities of who they are is wrapped up in this idea of fandom. So it's not necessarily that they have to collect these things to prove that they're the best fans. I think it goes a little bit beyond that, of like, that's the only way that they find acceptance with the only people that they have any communication and connection with.
But they do explicitly measure each other's level of commitment based on what they own. Like, in the very first one is the huge fight over who gets the Boba Fett, because whoever gets the Boba Fett is the bigger nerd.
Mm-hmm. But they also solve all their problems by whoever knows the most. So it's...
Yes, but the knowledge is not nearly as valued as the thing, the talisman. Because, and the way that they choose to solve their problems is, I have the knowledge and the thing. I'm double the nerd that you are.
Yeah, but the way they decide who gets the thing is by who has the best knowledge.
Well, yeah, but then, again, look at the opening of number 2. It begins with, with Bill being shitty. I got the one card that you need, Josh, and I won't trade it. Suck on that. And that gives Bill his shitty, neurotic one-up over Josh. I have the thing, and you don't have the thing. That's why I'm the president.
Sure, I don't, and again, like I said, I don't disagree entirely, because I get, that was an aspect of my life too. There was a brief period where I was a collector, and I bought toys, and I liked stuff like that, and there was a level of status symbol attached to it. Like I've got this rare thing, and I'm going to put it on display, and I just like it, and your identity kind of gets tied up into the I guess you could say the materialistic aspects, of
and
what they are,
it's
which is something that's
insidious.
very well. I was just gonna say that's pretty common, like human across all society. So getting back to this book that we were talking about.
I want to say as a brief aside, Evan Dorkin is mostly known as a creator, as an umbrella term, and as a writer. And I'm pretty sure most of his money comes from, like most writer artists, most of his money and most of his outside work comes from just writing. But I want to say that he is one of the great unsung artists out there. And I want to say that his style perfectly encapsulates the main thrust of the indie comics in the 90s, black and white and super dense. And there is no denser but yet equally coherent artist that I've ever even heard of, let alone seen.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up too, actually, to specifically talk about his art. Because as you said, I think, he's probably more primarily known as a writer. I mean, I primarily knew him as a writer for Space Ghost, but I've seen his art. But I have to admit, and this isn't, like, again, this isn't, like, meant to sound like a backhanded compliment or anything, but, like, the art in this book is really good.
Yeah.
Like better than I was expecting.
And extremely work intensive.
It's and the way I would describe it, honestly, it really blew me away. I mean, like I really really like this art. It's like a perfect combination of all of the best aspects of Jack Kirby and Robert Crumb.
Yeah.
Which are like two completely opposite artists.
Yeah.
And he distills both of them. And it's brilliant. Like I mean it. Like as a comic book artist, I really think that it is utterly brilliant. And just talking about like the alternate comics crowd, or like the art comics
which
crowd.
For the record, he does have one chapter. It's an alternate universe version of the Eltingville crew, who are art comics with an X, art comics makers.
It's perfect. Yeah.
Which also hits way too close to home.
Well, I was going to say that one actually, also hit really close to home, especially because the main character, the leader of the group, his name is Aaron Winkleman. His name is Aaron, and his last name starts with a W, kind of like my name. So there was a lot of these panels where I felt like he was talking to me. I mean, this is the character, Aaron is the character that's constantly bitching about superhero comics, but has this secret love for them. And I'm just like, oh my god, no, I don't want to see myself on a comic book page.
For me, it hits home in a fun way and not a chilling way.
Right. It was just, I mean, I know
because like the Eltingville Club was chilling because like especially just the naked compulsive consumerism was something that I fell victim to. Something that I not fell victim to. That's a stupid way to say it. But something that I participated in for a long time. And much like Bill Dickey, it made me a worse person, and it hurt me. So like where Eltingville Club was chilling, the Northwest Comics Art Club was funny. It's like, that's me in art school with all of my art school douchebag friends.
Right. Oh, it's very much art school kids.
Yeah, where the other one is just, here's dysfunction that's not going away. This one is just like, this is a stage of life that you grow out of. Enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I thought the Northwest Comics Collective was pretty perfect. Yeah. I really enjoyed it. But kind of going back to Evan Dorkin's art, like out of all the kind of like our alt comics guys, I'm not familiar with everybody, of course, but like your Dan Clowes, your Chris Wares. I have to say, Evan Dorkin's art is my favorite. It's my absolute favorite.
He's a highly underrated artist, and I think that
I completely agree.
And so like there's a crowd scene towards the end. It's the riot in San Diego, and he takes this bird's eye view of the crowd, and he draws every single face.
It's beautiful.
And
It looks like a crumb.
He
comic.
fits 3 faces on the back of your index fingernail. That's how small they are
Right.
reproduced in this book, which is one of the reasons why it took him so long to finally finish. Like, the last issue took him a year. He ran into trouble during that year, but it also took him a year just because it takes forever to draw the way that he draws, and it's. Mm-hmm. It might be one of those things where it stops being making art and starts being mark making, and that's why it's so dense. Right. Or maybe that's just what's going on in his head. But one way or the other, he's underrated as an artist, I think. Highly underrated. And I love his artwork.
Without sounding too much like old man complains about his hobby was better when he was young, I want to say one last thing about Evan Dorkin, specifically with his art. I can't stop talking about how much I like his art. But one thing in particular that I really enjoyed about this book, and that I kind of like felt a connection to, was I spoke at the beginning about how I connected with the characters in the first story, and I had this like sense of like, oh, this is really who I was, and this is, this was me as a kid, when I'm hanging out with my friends. And as the book progressed, I felt more of a connection, honestly, to Evan Dorkin's style, like his artistic style, and like how he was trying to present himself. Less about the characters and more with, the artist himself. And I don't want to be too presumptuous on that aspect, but one of the things that I talk about occasionally on this podcast, and again, just to keep bringing up that stupid Chris Ware episode I did, I sort of mentioned it on there, is that I'm always fascinated by like the different demographics of comic book readers. So you'll have like, your mainstream superhero fans, and then you have your alt comics, your Fantagraphic art comic fans, and you have your manga comic fans, and they're all really kind of like partitioned out and segmented. And then there's like a group of people that are sort of a crossover. Like there's like the smallest group are the people that just like to read comics no matter what. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I fall into that category. I mean, if you've listened to any of my podcasts, I read a lot of different books. I'm not the most well-read person in the world. Like there's a lot of weird stuff out there that I haven't read, and there's a lot of famous stuff.
If you keep taking my suggestions, you will be the most well-read comics reader.
Exactly. But the point I'm getting at is I oftentimes will say like, I like superhero comics, and I'm not going to apologize for it because sometimes, they can be fun. And at the same time, I love to sit down and spend 3 hours talking about Too Cool to Be Forgotten or an Alex Robinson comic. And I love to talk about, traditionally art comics. And I love talking about manga. Like, I read a lot of manga. So one of the things that I really like about Evan Dorkin's style, and this kind of goes back to what I said earlier, when I do think that he is all of the best aspects of Jack Kirby and Robert Crumb. He really does ride that line of like alt comic and kind of mainstream comic. Like I couldn't see him drawing a Spider-Man comic now, but I could see this art in a superhero comic at some point, like or in some way. And I think that Evan Dorkin, he is like a lot of creators, especially a lot of the alt comic creators, where like as a kid, it's pretty much impossible for you to be a kid growing up and into comics and not be into superheroes at some point. And there are a lot of guys that were into superhero comics as kids, and then they got into art. And they grew up and they moved on to Vertigo or whatever else. And a lot of these alt comic guys are like, I read comics as a kid. I still have a great appreciation for those comics, but I don't care about superhero comics now because it's all mainstream crap. Mm-hmm. That's fine. But what I really liked about this book was that Evan does have a very honest appreciation, I think, for a lot of the superhero stuff that he's making fun of. And I think that it shows up in the art. Mm-hmm. Like the way he presents this world is so not just perfect, but it's like a really like honest satire. And there's also some really good parodies, like straight art satires of classic superhero comics. I mean, you have that scene when they burn down the comic shop where Bill is buried under all the long boxes, and that is just like a perfect panel for panel recreation of that classic Spider-Man Steve Ditko issue.
Yeah.
Where Spider-Man's trapped under all the machinery and he has to, bust out. So, like, he really does this really good job of it being an indie comic, but it's still, like, there's lots of action and fighting, so it still looks kind of like a superhero comic, Like, because he's obviously read a lot.
He's still the guy that Stan Lee would call a true believer.
Yeah, exactly.
Or, like,
so
I would describe Evan Dorkin as, like, first of all, I love his self-deprecation because the most horrible character in this book looks exactly like him. And, like, his name is Dorkin, and the bad guy, and the other guy's name is Dickie. So it's
Which, by
not
the way,
a stretch.
Can I just say, like, how perfect it is that a guy whose name is Dorkin grew up to be a comic book artist?
Yeah.
To quote Kramer from Seinfeld, that's like an ice cream man named Cone.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I describe Evan Dorkin as comics' biggest cynic, and like Bill Maher says, behind every cynic is a true believer who had his heart broken.
Yeah. I definitely can empathize with that.
Yeah. I will end by saying this is a great book, and I loved it a lot, and I can't wait for the Dork hardcover, and this is wonderful, and I can't wait to get more stuff from Evan and Sarah, because they're great. And I will say, like, every old man says, fandom was better in my day, but I would like to take a moment and say, things are, like, as chilling as parts of this is, and as much of it, used to be over the top and it's not anymore, I will say that things are better now than when I was a kid. Because,
totally.
Like when I was a little kid, like I was getting bullied hard because I was into this obscure nerd stuff. And now that's no longer why kids are getting bullied. Like I having taught kids who are in the age range where I was getting bullied, those kids were growing up a lot nicer and a lot more expecting than I was. And part of it is because what we've been calling nerd culture has spread as far as it has. And a lot of the kids who indulged as hard as they did in nerd culture because straight up they've got Asperger's, like those kids are finding a lot more acceptance in school than they did when I was a boy. So things are like, as I'll harangue and I'll shake my fist and I'll stamp my foot and I'll yell, get off my lawn, but shit's better now than it was when I was a kid. I'll say that for damn certain.
Agreed. But yes, that is definitely going to end this episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening. My name is Aaron Walther. You can find comics that I write at thebirdlander.com and newhavencomics.com. You can find me on Facebook. I am on Twitter at AAWalther on Twitter, AAWALTHER on Twitter. And you can find episodes of this podcast at comicdna.podbean.com, or you can find them on YouTube. I have a new YouTube channel, Comic DNA. Just search Comic DNA on YouTube. That should show up. I'm trying to make these podcasts a little more interesting and add some like images and stuff of the comics in there, but I'm not, I'm lazy. I'm not particularly good at it. So, but if you don't want to listen to podcasts and you're just on the YouTubes, you can find me on there. Gabe, I know the last time we talked, you basically said you were trying to hide from the internet, I think. Something to that effect, right?
Yeah, hey, I also have a video series where you can just kind of follow what I'm making artistically, because this year I'm all over the place. I'm making book 3 of my comic series Purgatory Pub. It's a 4-book series, so it's nice to be over the hill on that one. I'm making kids books, and I don't know whether I'm going to self-publish those or get a publisher. If a publisher picks me up and can overlook the fact that I'm colorblind, then that'll make my decision for me. So follow my YouTube series to find out where that goes. And also, I'm in the middle of making a short film, which will be a lot of fun, but you won't be able to see until I submit that to film festivals. So it's not so much that I'm hiding from the internet; it's that I'm doing a lot of things that I'm not allowed to show you yet.
Just too dang busy.
Too dang busy, not getting paid. You can find me on Twitter at POOKEYG. It's an old nickname that I thought would stick, and it didn't, and I'm sorry. You can find me on YouTube, just Gabriel Dunston, GABRIEL DUNSTON, and I've got a video series where you can see my art vlog of what I've been up to since January, and some other videos where I do some quick draws and I talk about making art. And if I branch out and put together a website or a blog or something like that, if I ever do that ever again, you'll find out on YouTube before you find out anywhere else. And if you would like to follow me on Instagram, where you can kind of follow my comic making process a little bit faster, I am at Gabe Dunston Draws.
I think that covered everything.
I sure hope so.
All right. Well, I hope so too, because I'm not going to edit anything back into
it. Aaron, I had a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for doing this, and I hope you have a good night.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, good night, Josh.